today I want to talk, since it's the end of the year, I want to talk about a special topic, which is not directly related to blockchain stuff or R-chain stuff, but is related to the expressive power of the row calculus and the mobile process calculi in general. It's part of a research program I've been pursuing for quite some time, decades now, that has to do with representing physical information in computational systems, but in a particular way, in a compositional way. So, and this goes back to Wheeler's research program of it from bit, right, where he's trying to derive physics from information. So what I'm presenting here, or what I will be presenting, is an encoding of geometric information in the into the row calculus or the pi calculus, and I want to distinguish between encoding geometric information, like I'm doing here with a particular projective geometry, and encoding topological information, as I did with David Snyder in the encoding of knots. Right. So topological information doesn't preserve things like angles and distances. Projective geometry is a little different than, say, Euclidean geometry. It doesn't preserve the parallel line postulate. When you drop Euclid's parallel line postulate, then you get different classes of geometries, and the projective geometries is one family of that. And the projective geometries have a lot of interest in physics. I have recently been listening to Nima Arkani Hamed's lecture series that he gave at Harvard Physics this past fall. In my odd moments of spare time, driving here or there. So his calculation of scattering amplitudes, to simplify those calculations, he uses projective geometries quite a bit. So it made me think about this, and that's why I wanted to present these results, because it's sort of a tradition of mine to do an end of year presentation of results that I haven't published. And this sort of format or presentation of the phonoplane is connected to sort of these synthetic or abstract geometries, where or axiomatic geometries, where you just give a collection of points and a collection of lines, and then some relations that they satisfy, and that determines a particular geometry. And we can see that at work here in the phonoplane. So if you look carefully, you'll see that they're all labeled. So they're are the labels legible to you guys?
Yes, I can see them.
Okay, all right. So we have P1 through P7, right? So you can see that there are 7 points and there are 7 lines. And for ease of reading, I have color-coded everything. All right, so there are 7 colors and for the points. Now, the interesting idea is that we interpret lines as processes. And we're going to interpret points not as names, but as red X's. So possible red X's will correspond to particular points. And these are sets of red X's. So for example, if you look here down at this lower left-hand corner of the triangle, there's the point P1, it's red. And it lies on the lines L3 and on the line L1 and on the line L4. So we should expect to be able to interact on L1, L3, and L4, right? So, and in fact, that's exactly what this color coding shows us, right? So one thing that's really interesting about this encoding is that it is mixed summation. So that talks specifically about the expressive power of the language that encodes the geometry. It's strictly more expressive than the purely asynchronous version. And that comes to us from Caducia Palamidisi's results, where she shows that there is no par-preserving encoding of a mixed summation phenomena. So what I mean by mixed summation is right here, right? I've got a sum that includes both an input and an output. Typically, one might interpret summation only over inputs. So that's like guarded summation, right? Where it's like a message dispatch kind of situation where you've got different kinds of messages that you're filtering for, and on the basis of the kind of message, you're gonna go down one particular path. So like here's an example of that, right? So either the message came down the X13 channel or it came down the X14 channel, and depending upon that, we'll either do P13 or P14. So any questions about either the geometry or the encoding? So for example, someone might notice that there's this line L7, right? And L7 is not straight, right? So this is something that is specific to the projective geometries. So this is considered to be a line, even though it's not straight, right? But like, so if you look at L1, it has the points P1, P2, and P3 on it, and nothing else. Or if you look at L2, it has P3, P4, and P5 on it. And so each line has 3 points on it. And L7 also has 3 points, right? It's this line here. So that's an interesting fact about the projective geometries that's made vivid with the phonoplane, which is one of the simplest projective geometries. Does that make sense?
Yeah, follow it. The color coding is really helpful in this scenario.
Cool. Yeah. So one of the interesting things about the encoding is that it's compositional, right? So I make the phonoplane by taking all of these lines and just putting them in parallel composition, right? So this should make it obvious that I could encode other geometries. So this is this is a generic technique. It's not specific to the phonoplane. If you give me some collections of lines and points, in general, I can come up with an encoding that will do the trick. Now, there's another piece of the encoding that I have left sort of implicit here, which is that it starts off, so this geometry starts off as, you know, a recognizable geometry. I can read if you give me the phonoplane process description, right? Even if I don't know it's the phonoplane, I can reverse engineer the algebra and reconstruct the phonoplane. Right? And the color coding is sort of what, you know, is sort of gives you a hint or a clue as to how you might do that reverse engineering. But notice that after one step, one evolutionary step, right? So there are lots of evolutionary steps that could happen, but after one, unless these P's, these continuations like P13 or P14, unless they are, they get you back to a line, the geometry that you're in will change. So this says something very, very interesting about the process algebraic or process calculaic encodings like this, which is that they make it easy, they make it possible and relatively straightforward to encode dynamic geometries. So if you look at Euclid's texts, or you look at like the use of geometry in physics, it really wasn't until Einstein that we got this idea that geometry itself could be dynamic, that it could change, right? So the interesting thing about the Einstein field equations are that the stress energy tensor tells us where the matter and energy is distributed throughout the manifold, and the metric tells us how they're ultimately going to move, because it tells us how far apart they are. So because of the curvature of space, what's going to happen is that the distribution of matter and energy is going to change. And that's therefore going to change the curvature of space, which is then going to change the movement of change the distribution of matter and energy, and around the loop you go, okay? So that idea that the geometry itself, that the space itself is like a medium, right? Like water or something else that has its own dynamics. That's not that idea, at least as far as I know the history of geometry, it was a brand new idea. It was fresh. Right. In Newton's conception of the use of geometry in physics, the geometry part remained stable. It was, you know, this fixed charting of things for all time, now throughout eternity. But if you look here, when I do the encoding of the geometry into the process calculus, the making the geometry stable is in fact something that we have to do. It's an obligation for us, right? It's a part of the encoding that we have to get right. And so the encoding, this way of representing geometric information, shows us the possibility of dynamic geometries immediately, right? It's reminiscent of the same kind of comment that Bob Kuka makes when he talks about his diagrammatic representations of quantum mechanics. In his really insightful book, Picturing Quantum Processes, he gives a really good example of quantum teleportation. And he says, look, you know, quantum mechanics happens at this point in history, and 60 years later, we discover quantum teleportation. But if you look at these diagrams, we would have seen it almost immediately. And that's because the formalism was hiding this aspect of quantum mechanics that was just screaming out for exploration if you had a presentation that made it immediate. So the same thing happens here when we encode geometric information as computational information in this particular way, in this compositional style. Then what we get is that this sense of dynamic geometries, or the possibility or potential of dynamic geometries, is immediately present, immediately in our faces. The other thing that it brings out is that we can have a notion of continuity versus a notion of I guess continuity is the dividing line here. So you can imagine that the way the processes evolve as they interact is such that we always get to something that is a geometry, right? So even if, so one possibility is that as they evolve, they go back to being the phonoplane. So that's the stable encoding. But we can also evolve to something that isn't the phonoplane, but is still a geometry, right? In the sense that I can read back from the process structure some kind of points and lines structure. So that's another level. But then, and that would be what we would think of as a continuous encoding, or more, if we think of it just as this is the representation of geometry, then the geometry is continuous, right? So as it changes, it never leaves the realm of geometry. So as the dynamics, as the geometry is shifting around and evolving, it never becomes a process that we can't interpret in terms of points and lines or as a geometry. But of course, then there's a third possibility that it leaves the realm of geometry. And then there's the question of whether it returns to being a geometry. So there are two more possibilities, right? So one is that the encoding is stable. So it starts off as the phonoplane, and as it evolves, it returns to being the phonoplane. Every evolutionary step brings you back to being an encoding of the phonoplane. So that means you just organize the recursion in a particular way. And I leave that as an exercise for the listener. But the other thing that can happen is that it leaves being the phonoplane and becomes some other geometry, some different projective geometry, for example. So now we have the idea of evolving geometries. And then we have this idea that maybe for some period of time, for some snapshot of the evolution of computation, it is not a geometry at all. It's not recognizable as a geometry. And then through some number of steps, it returns to being a geometry. And by the way, this is like what the kinds of spaces that people in string theory have been contemplating, where you can imagine tears in space-time, right? And so the question is, whether or not, there are real physics which allow for these discontinuous sort of rips or tears in the fabric of space-time. And then the final possibility is it starts off as a geometry, and after a certain amount of evolution, just never returns to being a geometry. Right. So all of those are possible within this encoding, and we can think about each one of them and what they might mean. Right. So one of the interesting ones, this idea where you start off as a geometry, there's some geometric evolution, and then you leave the realm of geometry, and then you return to geometry. Right. So this is like miracles, right? This is water into wine kind of stuff, right? Because you've left the realm of physical configuration, or at least geometric configuration. So I like to point that out as a kind of dramatic way of pointing out what that might mean when we're thinking about this in terms of in terms of the import of an encoding like this. Especially, I think it's appropriate for the Christmas holidays to think about miraculously evolving geometries. So let me stop there and see if there are any questions about these ideas.
Can I ask maybe for simpler situation with just Euclidean geometry? How this will look like if we have this like simple case where we are.
The monoplane is the simplest case you can have for a projective geometry. That's why I did.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the simplest one.
I see. And can we do this with Euclidean geometry?
You can, yes, you can, right? It's the same idea. Your Euclidean geometry is given in terms of points and lines, axioms on points and lines. And so you can take those, you can faithfully interpret those axioms. I'm less. I started with the phonoplane because once you have Euclidean geometries, then you have an infinite number of points and lines, right? So it's not contained, whereas the phonoplane is this clearly finite thing.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. So that's why this is simpler and easier to go after.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Greg, when you were talking about the dynamic aspect of the geometry, I think of, the phonoplane is perhaps maybe expanding or twisting, coming into a new shape, sort of morphing. And this changing a shape is that ability to calculate or understand what this change of shape that's happening. Is that part of what we're seeing with the encoding, or is that sort of the next step evolution of the geometry?
So they go hand in hand. So yes, when we're presented with sort of high school geometry texts, or even these texts on axiomatic finite geometries, things like that. Jennifer Batten has a great book that was very influential for me on the finite geometries. They're normally presented as static, right? It doesn't even pique our imagination. Like nothing shows through to us to sort of suggest this idea that the phonoplane might turn into a different finite geometry. And it's not just bending and twisting, right? So there's a certain amount of bending and twisting that can happen in projective geometries. Like the phonoplane doesn't really care if you took one of the vertices and like stretched it way out, right? As long as you preserved all the relationships between the points and the lines, it doesn't care. But you could imagine adding more points and lines, right? And you could easily imagine that interacting at one of the vertices might, you could think of it as splitting that point into more points,
Mm-hmm.
and thereby adding more lines or something along those lines.
Okay.
Yeah. So, but yes, this and this, the evolution of the geometry goes hand in hand with the evolution of the process,
Mm-hmm.
and how the process, and at least in this encoding, how I mean, there are rules for how processes evolve, right? They have to evolve through the comm rule, through interaction, right? So there are only certain ways that that the processes can evolve, and so that so if we are encoding the dynamics of the geometry um, through, or we're encoding all information about the geometry through this representation of the process, that means that there's only certain ways that the geometry can evolve. So there might be ways that we could contemplate the geometry evolving that we can't faithfully model without, changing the encoding dramatically. But if we want to respect this idea of a compositional encoding, right? And here, this line down here is the biggest evidence that it's compositional, right? I have a completely independent characterization of a line, right? And in
Mm-hmm.
fact, all of these lines are all the same in some sense. What you'll find is that every line has a particular well, actually, it looks like there are two classes of lines, right? So here's a line that has two. Well, actually, let's do this in real time. See if we can find it. So this has two inputs, two outputs, and two inputs, right? This one has two outputs, two inputs, and two outputs, right? So these are two different kinds of lines, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right, and this one is the same kind of line as that one, and now here's a third kind of line, right? So we have an input, an output, and an input, two inputs and two outputs, and I guess there would be one other kind of line. So here's another one, right? We have an output, an input, an output, an input, and two inputs, right? So this gives us let's see, let me look at this one. This one has, this is our first mixed summation? Yeah, this one is the first mixed summation. So an output, an input, and an output. And let's look at this one. This has an output, an input, an output, and an input. All right, so it looks like we have only three kinds of lines. We could potentially have, nope, there's a fourth kind of line where we have two mixed summations, where we have all mixed summations.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, there's a fourth kind of line.
Mm-hmm.
Right, so so that gives us a way to sort of think about these are not all copies of the same object, but there are some copies of the same object, right? We notice that there are multiple instances of a certain kind of line, right? And so you could look at that characterization, that symmetry, as a way to even further compact the phonoplane, right? So there would be instances of the lines. So notice that these are all parametric in the x's, right? So if I were to be a little bit more careful about this encoding, I'd list the x's as parameters to these lines, and I'd put a new out here to say where the x's are coming from, or I'd put a parameter list here for phono, right? So I'd put a parameter list that includes all the x's, and then I would apply each of these, and I'd make sure that these have those argument lists. But without getting lost in the weeds, the important thing is that there are certain symmetries that are imposed because we're doing the process encoding, and there are certain symmetries that are imposed because processes can only evolve in certain ways. But recognizing that the evolution of the processes corresponds to the evolution of the geometry. So long-winded answer to your question, but
yeah, that was good.
um, and part of the reason I point this out, and I point this out in the context of the I point this out in the context of the uh, Einstein field equations, is to be very suggestive, right? What I'm trying to suggest is that what was an incredibly difficult intellectual challenge for Einstein and Hilbert, who were in a race to come up with the general relativity. It was difficult because the mathematics that they were employing didn't support those intuitions. Right? And in the same way that, when quantum mechanics was first formulated, the mathematics didn't support the recognition of quantum teleportation. But when Bob Kuka and Samson Abramsky come along and give axiomatic quantum mechanics, then and Bob's diagrammatic representation evolves from that, then quantum teleportation is obvious. The mathematics just presents it very, very clearly. And here, what I'm suggesting is that the encoding of the geometric representation into the process structure makes these other possibilities, like the possibility of the evolution of geometry, right in our face. It's one of the things we have to deal with immediately if we're going to make the thing be a stable encoding. And this collection of questions of stability and continuity are immediately evident in this encoding. And so it suggests, this goes back to an idea that I keep trying to present over and over again. So, like, between quantum mechanics and general relativity, there's this big gap. And the gap is because neither of those, of the standard formulations of those fields, are compositional. What we see is that when you do have compositional presentations, you get a certain kind of self-similarity. If you look at the presentation of the process algebras, they are clearly self-similar in the sense that a process can be a parallel composition of processes, right? So that's the evidence of the self-similarity, and that self-similarity can be mapped onto phenomena like fractals, like the Mandelbrot set or the Julia set, in a very clear and crisp way. And when you think about the Mandelbrot set, this sort of scale invariance is one of the qualities that you might demand of a system that was going to give the same laws for the very large and the very small. So if we think about gravitation as essentially governing phenomena at the cosmological level, and we think about quantum mechanics as essentially governing phenomena at the atomic level or the subatomic level, right? The gap is because they're not, the two presentations of those intuitions, those physical intuitions, are not compositional, and so they're not scale invariant. If you wanted to be scale invariant, you would be compositional. And lo and behold, when we give a compositional encoding of geometric information, the kinds of things that were super challenging for Einstein and Hilbert are now, immediately present in the encoding. They're right there in our faces, and we have to deal with them. So this is the kind of evidence, the kind of argument that I'm making, that the Wheeler's idea of deriving physics from some computational model is a good one. But Wheeler didn't have, Wheeler was a genius physicist, but not a genius computer scientist. It's difficult to be both, right? It requires a much bigger scope of contemplation, right? And so he didn't understand that there were certain very, very important aspects of computing that makes it a field in its own right. And one of them is this notion of compositionality. And another one is, and I put forward that it's an essential notion in computing, is bisimulation. So in particular, we can start asking how to classify these geometries. And as soon as we encode just like the main theorem in the knots work is that knots are ambient isotopic if and only if they're weakly bisimilar, right? This gives us a way to use bisimulation to classify knots. And if you have type systems that are in lockstep with bisimulation, then you can use spatial behavioral types to classify knots. So the same trick applies here. We can use bisimulation to classify different geometries, and then we can use type systems to classify geometries. So types become a query language for geometric information. And that's a very, very new idea, right? That idea is not present in Einstein and Hilbert's formulations at all. So they get as far as the dynamics of geometry itself. And that's kind of mind-bending, at least within that program, right? It took them a while to climb that hill. And now, because they climbed that hill, it's easier for others. But it's still a bit of a pinnacle for people or an obstacle for people to climb over. Here, this is more or less high school level complexity, mathematical sophistication. And we're getting new notions. We're getting the idea of classifying geometries using types. That's brand new. That's fresh. And so that's another reason to take a look in this direction. Part of the reason I present these results is because I'm not a physicist. I'm not even a particularly skilled geometer. I'm largely showing that these principles of compositionality give rise, and following them carefully and closely, right? Following them in such a way that they're more important than other aspects of how you might encode information. They give rise to these kinds of observations and these kinds of questions. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, I go ahead. Yeah, I was enjoying everything you were saying, and kind of putting it in relation to, I think a few weeks back you were talking about process algebra and how it examples of the real world of using it in automated vehicles. So I'm kind of putting these geometries together in my mind in a real world application to think about the possibilities of how they might work together with solving some issues and problems that we have.
Yeah, exactly. Um, so I just wanted to be clear or clarify something. So what I was saying a few weeks ago was in terms of ladle. So I haven't yet made the claim that one should use process algebras for reasoning about geometric information to the level where you might go after self-driving cars.
Mm-hmm.
But ladle, which is all about the generation of the type systems, um, doesn't depend on the specific model of computation, right? So the history of ladle is this. I am recognizing, so it's the early 2000s. I'm recognizing that on the one hand, the process algebraic representations do give us significant insight into the dynamics of chemical, biochemical, and biological systems, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this, there's lots and lots of work like Corrado Priami's work, or Hidi Shapiro's work, or Regev Aviv's work on these that give us evidence of this kind. That's an interesting avenue of research, and I'm looking at the practice of biology in real systems biology labs,
Mm-hmm.
in oncology labs, and other kinds of domain specific biological investigation. And I observe that on the one hand, in order to manage the complexity, they come up with very specific representations that help them. And the idea of bringing them over to the pi calculus or the rho calculus or something like that is a bit of a stretch. So, and moreover, it's becoming clear, especially with Luca Cardelli's work on the ambient calculus, that different process algebras are going to have different explanatory power in the different fields, right? So if you're interested in understanding, the flow of, let's say, properties through a system that's organized in terms of membranes, then either the ambient calculus or one of Luca's brain calculi are better suited. If you're interested in talking about interaction or binding, then the Milnor-based calculi are better. So the question is, like, if I'm going to have to derive a type system for each one of these in order to begin to think about query, I don't want to have to hand derive a type system every time I encounter another one of these domain-specific languages. Instead, I'd like to have an algorithm which generates the type system from a description of the domain-specific language that's helpful for one of these, biology labs. So that's the situation that I find myself in, and so, inspired by Abramsky's domain theory and logical form, I look for characteristics within these different domain-specific languages that they all share,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that's when it becomes clear that you can use a monad to express the term language. You can use a monad to express the collection properties. And in fact, even the rewrite systems are monadic. And so, and then the queries, the semantics of the queries or the types is absolutely that you interpret, hang on.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I just didn't want to. I thought I heard the screen door creak, and I wanted to make sure the puppy wasn't getting outside.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Anyway, so that's what is the clue about the distributive law, and that's how Ladle is born.
Mm-hmm.
But so long-winded story, but the main point is that I can now take, any computational model that fits certain parameters and generate a type system, which then becomes a query language.
Mm-hmm.
And so I could take, for example, the Clifford algebras, which are they're not process algebraic unless we come up with some encoding like this one. But the Clifford algebras are really good at representing geometric information. In fact, they're so good that people have been considering hardware accelerators for Clifford algebras. And so we can apply Ladle to the Clifford algebras and get type systems, which then become good query languages for geometric information, right? So Clifford algebras are already very good at geometric information, but it's hard to formulate a notion of query.
Mm-hmm.
But once you have a notion of type, you have a notion of query. So that's like insight number one is like, type systems equal query languages. So that, because what happens is type systems classify the term language, the terms in the term language under the realizability interpretation. So
Mm-hmm.
that's the thing that's really intriguing. And so now you can apply the algorithm that generates a type system to generate a query language, and now you have query language for geometric information. That's the architectural insight. So now this particular result goes further. It says, instead of using geometric specific algebras, we can use the process algebras or process calculi to encode geometric information directly. And then if we use Ladle on the process calculi, we can now classify geometries that way. So your observation or your question, the connection you're observing is it's there, but there's some nuance that I'm trying to bring to light. Right.
Yeah, and that connecting tissue of how it all kind of fits together, and how it all kind of moves together is that's the piece that I guess I just kind of wanted. So apparently you're thinking about those things as well, or with all this.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So
Okay.
I'm thinking at this very, very high level of requirement, right?
Right.
So if you go back, so in the early 2000s, I'm thinking about what do I need to give faithful representations of biological information, right? And so the dynamical stuff that Shapiro and Cardelli and that crowd were looking at is not, it's like barely scratching the surface of the story, because when you look at when you look at approaching folding, then you get geometry is right there in your face. You no longer get a chance to avoid geometry. And so I was asking myself, well, first of all, how do I get queries for geometric information? Oh, I can do that with this type generation stuff. But then can I go one level further? And can I get representations of geometry that give me new information? Right? So most, like if you look at the presentation of a vector space sits there. Vector spaces don't change themselves, right? You get morphisms between vector spaces, but even there, the nature of the vector space doesn't change. So typically there are certain aspects of mappings where you're imposing a kind of continuity condition that keeps you sort of in the vector space world. Whereas here, I can pose questions of continuity, but I'm able to move pretty freely from one geometry to another, so which is, where there are much more radical transformations that are possible.
Yeah, it's the timeline, the history. It's interesting for, at least for me, listening to the Casper Labs all this time, to kind of see the evolution of your thinking and these realizations that you have, and how all these components are kind of coming together and moving along. So it's kind of like Greg's geometric saga, just kind of following the story as it unfolds. So because last time, when you mentioned the Clifford algebra, I went and spent a day just kind of learning about it, getting an understanding of what it is, what it can do, and what it can't do. So as I learn about these different components and aspects, it helps me to kind of understand that, what's going on, what's Greg thinking about. And then as you're piecing these things together and coming up with new ideas, I'm seeing this evolution happening. So it's interesting to see all this take shape.
Yeah, exactly. So it was like this work, I actually saw this in 2008 or 9, I can't remember. I think it might have been 2008 that I wrote it down. No, so like whatever, 11 years ago, 10 years ago. It was at this point that I realized, oh wow, I can make space alive. Right. I can make space as computationally sophisticated as I want. So we can give it properties like, genetic inheritance, adaptation, and so all of the things that we normally associate with life can come. And so that's sort of the towards a living world work that I talked about in the spring of this year. That all comes out of that line of realizations. Like, no, this is actually, I can make this crisp. I can make this very, very clear. And with that, it's it's a dev stand-up time. So thank you, one and all. I really appreciate your time and attention, letting me talk about these things that are a little off the beaten path, but it is the end of the year, sort of the holiday season. I thought I'd give a little gift.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
I certainly enjoyed the presentation.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Have a happy new year.
Oh yes, Happy New Year to you, and
Happy
Happy
New
New
Year.
Year to everyone.